Okay, so this lecture will be on the introductory chapter to this World Religions course, Chapter 1, and this chapter is titled Religious Responses. In this chapter in particular, and throughout the course, we'll be covering a lot of ground in sort of a cursory or superficial way. We'll touch upon a lot of topics and introduce a lot of concepts and ideas, and not always have the opportunity to go into a lot of depth because this is an introductory course into world religions. So at any point, please feel free to contact me if you want more resources or information about something that interests you that I cover that maybe I didn't go into enough depth with. So you are encouraged to do that for all the topics that we cover. So the first thing I'd like to do is attempt to define the word religion. So the textbook tries to do this using a typical process for trying to define words, and that process is etymology, or giving an etymological definition for a word. So, etymology is defining words by looking at the roots of words and where they came from and what those roots used to mean in more ancient languages or in prior moments in history. So, trying to define religion is really messy. There's not a clear line between what is religion and what is not. And the word religion and the concept religion develops, this is a Western concept that has like a European history with particular traditions that developed in Europe and in the West that shaped and molded what the word religion means. Um, Often there is a lot of debate whether a particular tradition is a philosophy or a religion. So we'll look at sort of the etymology of these two concepts. So the word philosophy etymologically comes from two Greek roots, philia, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So I'll talk a little bit about this later, but philosophy just means the love of wisdom. So, philosophy often is concerned with understanding what is the foundation of life, what is the structure of reality, what gives life meaning, ethics. It can be very broad. Religion is often understood as like more specific and structured and perhaps more traditional in terms of what confines it. So, etymologically, religion comes from the Latin religare, to bind, or religio, obligation, bond, reverence. In the textbook, it talks about this etymological definition seems to suggest like to tie back. And what that could mean is that religion, the concept religion, assumes that there's a distinction between the everyday reality that we experience, um, through the senses, what we perceive, and versus a reality that is more deeper, more real, perhaps. And maybe that more real reality might be God or a spiritual realm or a supernatural realm that's more important or real or beyond the natural realm. Some terms that are kind of used to explain this distinction is conventional reality, is the conventional reality that we experience and perceive through our senses every day, versus a more ultimate reality. In the West, there's often an association of religion specifically meaning belief in an ultimate reality that's some sort of personal God or gods and goddesses. And we'll talk about in this course how not all of the major world traditions that we'll cover that are often considered world religions believe in or are associated with some sort of supreme God or impersonal or personal ultimate reality. So, throughout this course, we'll often just refer to ultimate reality as a more sort of inclusive concept for what we could be talking about here. And we'll get into this debate between philosophy and religion in a deeper level when we get to the tradition of Buddhism, which is not necessarily a tradition that believes or assumes the existence of a supreme personal God. So we'll get back to that in a deeper way when we get to that tradition. So as I started talking about the word religion and the concept religion is a Western concept, and so there's a danger of this class is taking place in the United States, and some of you may be from other parts of the world. I, as an instructor, am an American and coming from an American context. So there is a history and an issue of European people and Americans sort of projecting their concept of religion that comes from specifically a Christian context onto other traditions. And there's a lot of violence and a problematic history that comes with European colonialism in the attempt of Europeans to understand traditions outside of Europe. So, and this can sometimes lead to misunderstanding and a lack of knowledge about other traditions and confusion about other traditions that really comes with a pretty nasty history. So, for example, the word Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, and Confucianism, these are all labels for religions or traditions in other parts of the world. These actual words, the word Buddhism, the word Hinduism, so on and so forth, these words are words invented by Europeans during the history of colonialism as they attempt to understand the different religious, philosophical, spiritual systems of other parts of the world. So it's often a Western understanding of these other traditions and not really understanding or knowledge of these traditions on these traditions' own terms. For example, Hinduism and Buddhism were both coined by the British in the 19th century for census taking purposes as they colonized India. And Buddhism was the label they gave all of the traditions in the subcontinent of India that seemed to be connected to specifically this historical or non-historical or legendary figure, specifically the Buddha. Um, and Hinduism was a catch-all term that they coined for all of the other traditions in India that didn't fit neatly into the label of Buddhism or Islam. So Hinduism is a catch-all for all of the traditions that are native or indigenous to the entire massive subcontinent of India. So a lot of Hindus or people that practice Hinduism in India did not see all of those traditions as one thing, as one tradition. There's a lot of diversity there. And when we get to Hinduism, you'll see that. And in India, there was no, among people that practice Hinduism, they often refer to their tradition as the Dharma. They don't have a concept of religion. And Dharma can mean more life way or way of life. It can mean ethics. It can mean a lot of different things. But that concept and self-understanding of what Europeans would refer to as their religion really differs from how they experience their tradition and what Europeans deemed was their so-called religion. So this is a really delicate sort of study and field, and we kind of have to be aware of that. So specifically, when Europeans throughout the history of colonialism tried to understand other world religions or traditions or philosophies or life ways, specifically they were coming from a Christian context and imposing a Christian model while trying to understand these religions that didn't always work. So, specifically, that would look like looking for specific creedal statements, statements of belief that were like concise and sort of summarized the main beliefs of these other traditions. And a lot of other traditions didn't have this. And so sometimes that led to an assumption that there was a lack of organization or a lack of true religion, among different parts of the world. Another issue was that this is a general pattern, but among a lot of these Christians that were attempting to understand other world religions, they assumed within the context of Christianity this division between this what's called the secular. Sometimes the word profane is used, and profane doesn't mean like profanities like swear words. It just means like secular versus sacred. So for a lot of Christians throughout history, it's very clear, there's a clear demarcation between when you're doing religion and when you're not. So going to church is a sacred act, praying is a sacred act, but tending to the fields and other things that you do throughout your day are sort of secular or profane. So there's a clear line between when you're doing religion and when you're not. So they would assume when they would observe people in other parts of the world that it'd be clear when what they're observing is, religion, so to speak, and when it's not. And that's not actually how a lot of other people throughout the world operate outside of a Christian context. And we'll talk more about this later in the course, but for a lot of people around the world, the sacred imbues all of life. That it's not really like they're doing religion now and now they're not, that it's their religion, so to speak, imbues everything that they do throughout their life. Even like mundane or everyday tasks have spiritual significance. So these Christian Europeans observing these traditions would say that they don't, that this community or this area doesn't, the people of this area don't have a religion, when that really isn't accurate. It's just that they were looking for a specific pattern of religion or spirituality that didn't really exist outside of their worldview. Another issue has been that a lot of European Christians, while trying to understand other traditions, sort of assumed that other people in other parts of the world only practice one religion at a time. And as you'll see throughout this course, that is not often the case. That in fact, you see a lot of what's called syncretism, where in a lot of parts of the world, people practice multiple religions or traditions at the same time. So, for example, in China, a lot of people practice and embrace a lot of elements of Taoism as well as Confucianism. Another concept we need to look at is spirituality, which the textbook defines as the inner dimensions of religion. So, experiences, beliefs, and values. So, this spirituality is sort of a broader concept than religion. It's part of religion, but it can also be personal and non institutional. That's why there's a growing number of people in the US and throughout the world that say that they're spiritual but not religious. So, what that often means is that if you say you're spiritual but not religious, that you care about questions about meaning in the universe, you might believe in some sort of ultimate reality. So on and so forth, some of the deeper, larger dimensions of religion. But what you typically are rejecting when you say you're spiritual but not religious is the idea that you want to explore these beliefs and values in a formal institutionalized setting. So typically what the person is saying is that they don't want to belong to a specific church or organization or be part of some sort of pre-packaged religious worldview that tells them how to explore their spirituality, so on and so forth. It's more independent and personal. It's non-institutional. It doesn't involve an institution or organization or community telling them, how they ought to practice their beliefs or what their beliefs ought to be. Um, and being spiritual but not religious, doesn't necessarily involve having to specifically believe in God. It's not necessarily theistic. It doesn't necessarily have to believe in some sort of supernatural either. It can often, this is where it can kind of just look like being philosophically minded, but not necessarily like religious, but still being concerned about questions about meaning. A helpful word that kind of gets at that is the word existential. Existential is a concept from philosophy that just talks about thinking about the nature of existence and the questions of why, why does reality exist? Why do we exist? What is the meaning of this? And that a lot of that sort of existential concerns can be spiritual but not religious, and they can often be sort of very scientifically minded without necessarily believing in a supernatural. So a famous quote that sort of gets at that is, "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?" So Douglas Adams was someone that was invested in, spirituality, or in an existential way without necessarily believing in like a supernatural. And it gets messy because the word spirituality has come to mean maybe this more these existential concerns, but the word has the word spirit in it. So it sort of connotes some sort of spirit reality, or that the material world isn't enough. But that sort of understanding is eroding, and it's becoming a term for people that do believe in an ultimate reality, in a spirit world, and a supernatural outside of the context of organized religion, but also people that don't believe in that, but still are concerned about meaning and awe and wonder and questions about why and the nature of existence. So, another topic mentioned in this chapter is the question of why are there religions? Um, and some ways of looking at this is that, like, historically, something that needs to be acknowledged is that in human history, questions about why are we here? What is reality? And how ought we act and behave based on our understanding of reality, and our positions on the nature of reality, that formerly, like, things that we would consider religion permeated all aspects of life, which is kind of what I'm talking about. That the division between the sacred and secular is a very specific sort of religious or spiritual construct that comes like pretty recently within human history. So often, what we would consider ancient religions are often referred to as life ways, because they were um, all of the energy that people that belong to religions where there's a sacred and secular distinction, all of that energy they put into that used to just be part of all of life. Um, so prior to the rise of the major world religions, so Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, often called the Abrahamic faiths, and other major world religions that happen within more recent history, within the last few thousand years, sort of the default or original religious traditions or life ways of human beings are referred to as indigenous traditions. And the next chapter in this class will focus just on these indigenous traditions. So the word indigenous just means native to a place. So the idea is people all over the world, settled in all parts of the world over the last like tens of thousands of years of human history, and practice nature based traditions all over the world. And there's still about 4% of the world's population, which is a small percentage, but a massive, millions of people still practice these indigenous traditions. And there's a lot of diversity among them. But typically, early humans and indigenous humans today that practice these ancient traditions, the traditions revolve around an understanding and experience of nature in really sophisticated and interesting ways. Um, so even in Europe, for example, and there's this close association of Europeans and Christianity, but Christianity was sort of forced upon Europeans through the imperialism of the Roman Empire as the Roman Empire became Christian. So, for example, the word pagan, which is that word is related to the word earth, refers to all of the original nature-based traditions of Europeans. Um, and Native Americans have their own various indigenous traditions. The Aborigines or the natives of Australia have their own indigenous traditions. Much of Africa for centuries has been Christian and Muslim. But prior to that, while that was going on throughout Africa, there are various indigenous African traditions. As I mentioned, in the subcontinent of India, Hinduism captures all of the different traditions that grew and have been practiced in India, to up to prehistory. So all human beings, if you go far back enough in their history, are from a particular part of the world that practice some sort of nature-based indigenous tradition. And an element of that is that there might have been ceremonies and rituals and sacred objects and things like that that we'll get into the next chapter, but that typically this was more of a way of life, just a life way, and the lines between religion and culture get very blurry. So, for the question of why are there religions, one way of looking at it is religion is a more formalized process that happens, throughout human history as lifeways become more formalized, and there are specific charismatic figures that make developments in them, which we'll talk about when we get to some of the major world traditions. So religion turns into an object of study with the European Enlightenment. And we'll talk about this later. So again, the study of world religions is something that originates with Europeans as they develop capitalism and begin a sort of imperialist colonial project. And it has a problematic history. There's often a lot of racism involved in that project in order to sort of justify what they were doing economically and culturally to other parts of the world. The textbook organizes the answers to the question, why are there religions, in three main groups. The materialist response, the faith response, and the functionalist response. So I'm going to go through each one of these responses and they'll each get their own slide. So we'll move on. So the question of why are there religions? A materialist would say humans invented religion. The word materialist and materialism is confusing because many of you might be familiar with like the pop star Madonna has a song from the 80s, I Am a Material Girl. And if you're materialistic and stuff like that, people often mean that you're really into buying fancy things and being a good consumer. And that makes sense in our sort of pop culture context. But in the context of philosophy, materialism means believing that only the material world exists, denying that there's a supernatural realm, thinking that all of reality is just matter. That's where material comes, matter and energy. So a materialist would say, yes, religion exists, but the supernatural world or ultimate reality is invented by humans, that only the material world exists. So a famous example of this would be Karl Marx, who was critical of capitalism, and he's famed with saying that religion is the opium of the masses. So he did not believe in God, he did not believe in an ultimate reality, but he makes this claim, and it was specifically charged at Christianity. And he believed that economic elites or capitalists were able to get away with a economic system that was really brutal to the majority of people and very exploitative, because religion helped with that. Um, the majority of people who were working in terrible conditions in factories, and being exploited and really brutalized, the masses, so to speak, that were experiencing this, put up with that because religion, specifically in this context, Christianity, was like a drug to them, that the claims of Christianity weren't real, but it served the political purpose of making them content with the misery that they were being given in this life, because Christianity was telling them that this life doesn't matter and that in the next life they will be rewarded. So that's specifically what he meant. So for him, humans invent religion and invent claims about the supernatural and ultimate reality for political purposes. And that's sort of the example that he gave. So another perspective is the faith perspective, that religion exists because the ultimate reality exists. There really is a God or supernatural or an ultimate reality. So naturally, religion exists because humans have some awareness of this and want to express it and participate in it. So what's helpful is the word faith means that it's not something that can necessarily be proven in like a concrete way or a scientific way. And what's really interesting is Paul Tillich, a major Christian theologian of the 20th century, claimed that it was demonic to try to prove the existence of God, because you turn God into an object to be proven, and it's like objectifying God. It's limiting God to think of God as an object that can be proven. But in general, a lot of religious people and a lot of people that practice spiritual traditions accept that knowing that it exists and believing that it exists is a matter of faith, not a matter of direct proof or necessarily rational knowledge. Mysticism is having some sort of direct personal experience with ultimate reality. It's to perceive truth or ultimate reality directly beyond the senses, beyond the limits of human reasons, beyond blind belief. And mystical experiences typically fall into two major categories, not always though. One form of mystical experience that's usually associated with more Eastern traditions, but not necessarily, is having some sort of experience of the ultimate oneness of all of reality, the interconnectedness of all of reality, where the line between self and other, self and God maybe, erases and there's an ultimate oneness, versus a numinous experience, which is a non-rational, non-sensory experience of that which is totally outside the self and cannot be described. So that would be some sort of mystical experience of some ultimate other outside of oneself, perhaps God. And some other terms that are used to describe these sort of mystical experiences might be enlightenment, realization, illumination, awakening, gnosis, which is the Greek word for knowledge, or even self knowledge. A functionalist believes that religion is useful. This is another answer for why there are religions. So, a functionalist would say religions exist because they're useful for society and individuals. For example, they can help define the community or the individual. They can provide a sense of identity. They can help group survival if all the group has the same understanding about reality. The functionalists might look at dogma, which are really strict, rigid claims about truth, religious claims about truth and ethics and the nature of reality, and that how it's kind of answers that cannot be questioned versus questions that cannot be answered. And that dogma can be really useful for people because it gives them a sense of comfort. It helps them deny the fact that reality has a lot of uncertainty. It can give people a sense of control in a world or a reality that can be very chaotic and scary because of its chaotic and uncertain nature. What's important to understand is that a functionalist could come from a faith perspective or could come from a materialist perspective. That a functionalist is acknowledging the usefulness of religion, not necessarily making a claim about whether it's true or not. So Karl Marx, as we mentioned, is a materialist, but he's also a functionalist. He thinks that religion isn't real or true, but he thinks that it's useful. He thinks that it exists even though it's made up, so to speak, because it's politically useful. There are functionalists like Bowker who do come from like a faith perspective, but also think that religions exist because there is an ultimate reality and it is true, but that it is also useful, that it helps people have a sense of organization and meaning and comfort in their lives. So, we talked a little bit about this, but again, it's important to understand the concept of the sacred versus the profane, or the sacred versus the secular, and how that's not necessarily part of the experience of people all over the world in their experience of religion. And some other terms are immanent, which would mean close to you or even material, what's right in front of you, versus transcendent, which would be outside of the senses. So immanent can be material and transcendent can be sort of spiritual or otherworldly. Immanent can be conventional reality, everyday reality, and transcendent can be that ultimate reality, the beyond. Another important term to know is theism, which means belief in God. So that is not necessarily a part of all of the major world traditions and world religions that we'll be talking about, but it's certainly a big part of of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, some specific forms of theism are monotheism. So, etymologically, mono is a root that means one, and theism means God. So, monotheism means one God, belief that there is only one God. Polytheism, poly means many. So, polytheism is the belief in many gods. Something that's kind of interesting is monism, comes from mono, meaning one, ism. So it's the belief that reality is ultimately one, that all that exists is some one ultimate reality. So another way of putting this would be that we are all God and nothing exists but God. Specifically, panentheism means pan, all is in God. So panentheists believe that everything that exists is God, but that there's also some transcendent aspect of God that's supernatural or more ultimate than God as God exists through us or through material reality. Pantheism just means all is God, and that would be the idea that there isn't some sort of transcendent aspect of God, that reality is just God, and reality might just be matter and energy. Some other terms would be agnosticism. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. So you put an A in front of that, and it means not knowledge. So it means without knowledge. So to be agnostic is to not be sure, or to not say that ultimate reality exists or not, to have some sort of uncertainty. And there are two main types of agnosticism. Hard agnosticism is the belief that it's outside of the limits of human knowledge to know whether there is an ultimate reality or a God. So a hard agnostic is someone that doesn't know. They're an agnostic. They're not going to. They say that they don't know if there's an ultimate reality or a God, and that they're not going to like make up their mind later. They believe that it's impossible to know as a human being whether there is or not. Versus a soft agnostic is someone that at a particular moment, as an individual, they haven't made up their mind yet. They're uncertain whether there's a God or ultimate reality, but they're on some sort of spiritual journey, and maybe in the future they expect that they will be a theist, or believe in ultimate reality, or they won't. Um, an atheist has theism and an A in front of it. So that means without God or not God. So an atheist is someone that does not believe in specifically a God, or is not a theist. A lot of theists point out how it is it's not possible to disprove the existence of an ultimate reality or a transcendent God. So, a term that some atheists have come up with is de facto atheism, which is basically that they are hard agnostics that just doubt the existence of God. So, that might be a helpful term. Non-theism, which is technically what Buddhism as a tradition is, and you can make that argument, is it's not a theistic tradition, and it's not an atheistic tradition necessarily either. Non-theism is sort of having an indifference when it comes to the existence of God or a supreme being. Or the idea that belief in a God or making a claim about God's existence is not necessary. So, for example, the Buddha was often asked whether he believed in a God or whether there was a God. And he said that being concerned about whether God exists or not would be like if you were hit with an arrow. And instead of being concerned about taking care of your wound and taking care of yourself and the fact that you were hit with an arrow, you started obsessing about who hit you with the arrow. So for the Buddha and for the tradition of Buddhism, what is of primary importance is suffering and overcoming suffering, not these questions about the nature of reality. You only need to be concerned with those types of questions to the extent that you are concerned about solving the problem of your own suffering. Another term is deism, which we'll talk about more later. But deism was a very specific form of a very specific position taken by a lot of European intellectuals during the European Enlightenment of the 18th century. So a lot of the founding fathers of the United States were deists, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, and Benjamin Franklin, and so on and so forth. And what a deist believes is that there is a God that creates, there's a creator for this reality, but that the creator in no way interacts with creation after creating it. This is not Christianity. So Thomas Jefferson, for example, was a deist, so he believed there was a creator, but that the creator did not interact with creation. So that would include the creator did not become Jesus Christ or Jesus of Nazareth. So Thomas Jefferson took the gospel accounts in the Christian Bible about Jesus and took out all of Jesus's claims to divinity and all of the claims about the supernatural and God, and he published the moral teachings of Jesus. So this is really interesting because if you look in the founding documents of the United States, it does say that we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, and they did believe that there was a creator, but there's no mention of God beyond that, and there's a clear separation of church and state. So the intention was that a lot of the founding fathers were not Christian and did not envision the United States as a Christian nation. They technically were not Christian at all. And it's interesting, the word in God we trust on our currency and putting one nation under God and the Pledge of Allegiance didn't happen until the 1950s under President Eisenhower as part of the Cold War against communism, because communism in a classical sense is usually atheistic. So it was the idea of building up the United States as God-fearing capitalists taking on the atheist communist world. This is a very important slide that you want to definitely focus on. So these are approaches to religions other than one's own. So the wording of this is problematic because you might not belong to any religion or identify as part of any tradition. So in that case, this would just be approaches to religions. So some different terms that are helpful to use would be the word exclusivist, which is usually what people assume as the typical perspective. So an exclusivist believes that their religion is the true religion and that everybody else is wrong. And sometimes it's even more specific than that. So there are some Christians, for example, that not only believe that non-Christians are wrong, but that even some Christians are wrong, that exclusively not just Christianity, but exclusively their particular interpretation of Christianity is right, and others are wrong, excuse me. And then moving along, and that's not necessarily how everyone approaches their tradition. That makes sense if you have a very literal interpretation of your tradition and its truth claims. An inclusivist believes that their tradition or religion, and maybe even their interpretation of their religion or tradition, is the best, but that others can be right, or other traditions and interpretations can be true to the extent that they agree with one's own religion or tradition or interpretation. And then a universalist is someone that believes all religions and all traditions are right or true because they're all the same. And a pluralist is somebody that believes that not only are all religions or traditions, they're cool with them all and true in some sense, but that they're also different in significant ways, and that those differences are worth celebrating. That it's a good thing that there are differences in religion, and that it adds to the sort of vibrance of the human experience, and that it's a good thing and they ought to be celebrated. So the pluralist, to make sense of that, you kind of have to believe that religions maybe aren't always making very literal claims, but maybe more symbolic claims in order for that to sort of make sense logically. In this class, we're sort of assuming that we're not out to evaluate other traditions. We can be critical of other traditions, but not on the basis of whether their claims about ultimate reality are right or wrong. Sort of the project of this class is to just understand how individuals or communities that have different beliefs, how based on those beliefs those individuals or communities experience the world. And in the description of this class on the syllabus, it does talk about how um, part of this class might involve you as individuals and as students sorting through your own personal beliefs and feelings about religion. And that's great, and you're encouraged to do that. But the types of conversations that we'll be having on the discussion boards and like within the context of these lectures, the intent or focus is more what do other people believe or practice, and how does that shape their understanding of the world? Sort of just broadening our ability to understand other people and empathize with other people in a way that's sort of tolerant. Another important concept is the word ritual, which the textbook defines as actions that are predictable and repeated rather than spontaneous. So it can involve a way of worship to express reverence to God or ultimate reality, enter in communion or communication with the divine, request help, and maybe mark major life stages. And we'll talk about different rituals within different traditions. I was sort of getting at this, but another very crucial concept is the word symbol or understanding the symbolic. So, a symbol would be images borrowed from the material world that are similar to ineffable or intangible spiritual experiences. So, for example, describing some sort of mystical experience as an awakening. So if you have an awakening in this sense, you weren't actually sleeping, but you might use the symbolic language of I was asleep spiritually and now I'm awake spiritually to describe symbolically what it's like coming into the mystical knowledge that you've had. Very commonly, you have the association of vertical symbols with power and hierarchy. So, for example, the term higher power, by higher power, if something is above you, it's like it has power over you or it's more important. Traditionally, heaven or the realm of God or ultimate reality is above in the sky. The sky is associated with spirituality um, and ultimate reality, and what's lowly and below is considered like less important or less spiritually significant. And we'll sort of challenge some of this. And within a lot of traditions, there are more literal interpretations where, actually believing that there is a heaven realm in the sky and literally believing God or gods and goddesses reside in a physical way above in the sky versus symbolic and thinking that that's just symbolic language. And allegories are extended metaphorical narratives. And a metaphor is also just like using symbolic language. So, for example, the book of Revelation in the Christian Bible. Some people believe the book of Revelation is a literal description of the end of the world. And it's a very kooky and very interesting description that can kind of read like a bad acid trip. Like there are some sort of monsters or creatures that appear in the book of Revelation that are part like eagle and tiger or whatever. And some people literally believe that that's how it's going to go down at the end of the world, if there's going to, and that there literally is going to be an end of the world. Another way of looking at it is that scholars believe that the author of the book of Revelation, John the Revelator, was exiled by the Roman Empire, and that very bizarre imagery is symbolic, because the book of Revelation isn't intended to be a literal description of the end of the world, but is anti-empire propaganda. That there are these monsters or creatures have hybrid features from animals that symbolize different empires that have persecuted Jews and Christians. So this hybrid creature is sort of a combination of the mascot of the Babylonian Empire, the Greeks, and the Romans, for example, and that the whole book is a metaphor, is a symbolic story or allegory, and is not literal. Myth is another important concept. So, myth has the connotation of being untrue or false. And within the context of studying religion, that's not necessarily the case. So, a myth might not be true in a scientific or a historical sense, but it can be true on a deeper level. So, myths are symbolic stories that communities use to explain the universe and their place in it. And they can have various functions. They can be mystical and help you have mystical experiences. They can explain the cosmos. They can explain the community structure, and they can help you psychologically too. Even if they are not historically or scientifically true, myths can be true on a symbolic level or a mystical level. And these are some questions to help sort of sort through some of the things that we've talked about in the first part of this lecture so far. So, what does someone typically mean when he, she, or they say he, she, or they are spiritual but not religious? What aspects of religion are he, she, or they rejecting? Explain 3 theories that attempt to account for the existence of religion, and what does each theory assume? And explain the following terms and their relation to each other: exclusivism, inclusivism, universalism, and pluralism. So we will stop there.